I do want to thank you all for praying for me this week. Last Sunday, if you recall, I told you I was going to have my oral defense on Monday, and I did, and I survived, and I passed, and so I'm very, very grateful. So thank you for all your prayers. I had to do a few more edits, so I finally turned it in at 1:30 p.m. on Wednesday. It was probably the most intense press of the send key that I've ever done, but it was like, okay, I'm finished. It is finished. So after 10 long years, I applied to that program and then finally finishing. So a few people have asked if they could come to the graduation and things. I'll send some information. So, you are invited, but you are not obligated at all. I am just thankful for your prayers and support. Well, this morning, we're going to continue where we left off from last week as we looked at the life of Abraham as an example of one who lived by faith. And if you recall, we talked about how Abraham obeyed God. God called him and said, I want you to go to a land that you do not know, right? And that's just mind-boggling to think that Abraham would just do that he would leave his land, his country, his people, and even his own family. All he knew that God had told him was that I'm going to give you a land as an inheritance. But he never actually inherited the land himself. He was a sojourner. He literally lived in tents his whole life, as did his son Isaac and even Jacob. But he wasn't looking for just a temporal fulfillment. He knew that God was building something that would have eternal value. The promise of a city which had its foundations, whose architect and builder was God. We're not here to say I'm going to be just like an Abraham or a Noah or an Enoch, but the whole underlying premise here is what does it mean to live by faith? And it looks different in different people's lives. But as we looked at even from the first verse of Hebrews 11, what is faith? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. If you look at especially the life of Abraham, he lived in hope for, but never got it fulfilled. He lived for things unseen that he never actually got to see. But it didn't change the fact that he lived by faith. I think what's amazing, and even though people back then still lived a bit longer, he still started out at 75 years old when he left Haran to go south to Canaan. And it wasn't going to be until he was 99 years old when he has the conversation with God, and God says, you're going to have a son. And Sarah is going to bear this biological son, which will be a fulfillment of the promise that you would be the father of nations. But 25 years go by from the time he leaves Haran to the time when Isaac is going to be born. And so he hears from God at 99 years old. When Isaac is born, he is 100, and Sarah is 90 years old. And it's interesting how they are described like good as dead. But let's look at Sarah today. In Hebrews 11, there are only two women named by name, Sarah and Rahab. And so you think, well, what can we gather out of that? I mean, nothing much other than, well, they're being shown as the list of these witnesses who give testimony to living by faith. Now, I read a good number of commentators who said Sarah herself was not really the one exercising faith on her own. This is actually part of Abraham's narrative, And so she really had no active involvement in the whole scenario. This was really about Abraham's faith. And I thought, okay, well, is that true? I mean, even if a lot of the commentaries say that. So I was like, well, let's look at the life of Sarah. And one of the neat things about Bible software is I can just type in Sarai or Sarah, and bam, I get all the verses. And I go, okay, let's look and see everything that the Bible has to say about Sarah. So turn over to Genesis chapter 11, verse 29, and we're going to do a little bit of a survey of the life of Sarah. And in verse 29, now this is talking about the generations of Terah, who is the father of Abraham. Abraham has two brothers, Nahor and Haran. Haran's the father of Lot. Haran dies before Terah does. And so in verse 29, it says, Abraham and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. And the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. And Sarah was barren. She had no child. What an introduction. I mean, it's almost like if you were to introduce Sarah here and say, hey, I'd like you to meet Sarah. She can't have children. I mean, who wants to be introduced that way? I mean, especially in that time and in that culture, the worst thing for a woman was that you could not have children. I mean, it was almost as if like, well, hey, that was your purpose in life. And if you can't do that, you have no social value. And that's so sad. Because if you can imagine living in such a culture, she's having to deal with that, being looked down upon, even if it wasn't explicitly said. Now you go to Genesis chapter 12, verse 5, and it says that Abram took his wife Sarai and departed to Canaan. So they leave Haran. He takes his wife. He also takes Lot's family. And so they head down south. And on their way, the journey doesn't give every specific detail, but they end up going to Egypt. Okay, and as they're getting close to Egypt in Genesis 12:11, Abram asked Sarai to tell the Egyptians that she was his sister, which was actually a half-truth. Okay? She was a half-sister, same father, different mother. But it was because he was afraid. Now, why was he afraid? Well, it says that in verse 11, Sarai was beautiful in appearance. Now, that when we hear that, I think in our culture, we immediately would just think, oh, she was really pretty. And it might have been the case. But you got to remember, she's probably somewhere in her mid-60s at this point. And some commentaries say, well, in that era, mid-60s was like the new 30s. Something like that. I don't know. We don't have much to work with. But there was a lot more involved than just physical beauty. I mean, it could have been that when they get to Egypt, Abraham is recognized for being someone of high social status. And so she is attractive in that way too. It's interesting what the commentaries have to say. But Abraham is afraid enough. And later on, he says, well, it's because he doesn't think there's a fear of God in these places. So he tells Sarai, well, you can imagine that conversation. Hey, when we go there, can you just tell him that you're my sister? Now, what do you think Sarai is thinking at that time? I mean, ladies, what would you think if your husband told you to do such a thing? You probably would not be too happy. But she does. She cooperates. And it gets to the point where she actually is going to be taken by the Egyptian king and the Pharaoh and marry him. But God intervenes. This happens again later on with Abimelech of Gerar. Same situation. Abraham says, can you do this for me? And that should tell you something about Abraham. He's supposed to be an example of faith, but where is his faith? I mean, if Sarah's not being even recognized by some commentaries that she had any faith of her own, you got to ask, well, where was Abram's faith? Why would he not trust God in those situations? I mean, he was willing to leave his country, his people, his family, and then he goes to Egypt and he's afraid of what might happen, that they might kill him because of his wife. Well, God is gracious and merciful, delivers them. Jump over to Genesis chapter 16, verse 1. And there it mentions again that Sarai does not have children. I mean, if there's one thing, I don't know, if you would want to be remembered by, if someone mentioned you in a book, wouldn't at some point you go, like, you don't have to keep saying that. Like, I know that's true. Now, Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And she had an Egyptian servant woman whose name was Hagar. Now, this is the first time that we actually now see Sarah is doing something of her own initiative. And what is it that she does? Verse 2. So Sarai said to Abram, now behold, Yahweh has shut my womb from bearing children. Interesting that she notes that. She says, God is the one who is not letting me have children. So here's my solution. Please go into my servant woman. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. Now, Abram's not too helpful by saying, hey, I want you to lie about being my wife. Just can you tell me to be my sister? Now, here's Sarai saying, well, you know, I can't have children. God won't let me have children. So here's my solution. Take my servant woman here, who interestingly enough is Egyptian, and I want you to essentially marry her so that through her, she's going to be like a concubine kind of thing. Through her, I will formally be able to have children. I will be able to say, whatever child she bears will be under my name. Now, we see that's something that happens later on with Jacob, especially, right? He marries Leah and Rachel. And when Rachel can't have children, she does the same thing. Wants you to have my servant woman here, have children through her, Leah. She has a bunch of children, she stops. And so she says, why don't you take? So Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, does the same thing. They listen to their wives in pursuing a solution that is not what God intended. Now, you got to think about, why is this such a serious thing? Well, you see, by that time, this is Genesis 16. You go back to Genesis 12, God had told Abram, I'm going to make you into a great nation. So implied in that, you're going to have children. And then again in Genesis 15, Yahweh tells Abram, do not fear, I will be a shield to you, your reward will be great. And Abram understands what God is saying, but he says, what will you give me as I go on being childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. So in Genesis 15, Abram still is, well, okay, God, you're saying this, but I don't have any children. And I'm getting older, and I've formally declared as the heir of everything that I own, Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram says this, since you have given no seed to me, behold, one born in my house is my heir. Now, God gives a very clear response. I mean, one of the things I thought about this when I was reading this account is God and Abram are having an actual conversation. I mean, what would you do if you had a direct conversation with God? And it's interesting to see kind of like what gets said. Abram says, since you have given me no seed. God responds, okay, the one that you're talking about, Eliezer, he is not going to be your heir. But one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. God is stating this. Remember, this is God speaking. Abram, you will have someone from your own bloodline, your seed. And in Genesis 15:5, God tells Abram, look toward the heavens, number the stars. He tells Abram, go ahead, count all the stars. And if you can count those stars, that's how many descendants you'll have. So God is guaranteeing that Abram will have a bloodline. And it says there that Abram believed in Yahweh. He believed him, he trusted him, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And then in verse 7 of Genesis 15, what we see, and I think I mentioned this before, is God cuts a covenant with Abraham. And the word is very specific in terms of cutting a covenant. And what he did is he took some animals, he cut them in half, and then he walked through them. That was what an ancient Middle Eastern covenant looked like. And it was saying this, by walking through these split animals, if I break this covenant, may this happen to me. Cut me in half. In other words, you could kill me. It's a unilateral covenant. You see, Abram doesn't walk through. It's only God who does. But it's interesting, as God explains this covenant, he tells Abram certain things. In verse 13, he says, know for certain that your seed will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. They will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. I mean, that's an interesting detail. Like, why is God telling Abram this? But God says, I'm going to also judge the nation that enslaves them. But your seed will come out with many possessions. And then he tells Abram this, you will go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, I was trying to think about this from the vantage point of Abram. How's he supposed to understand all this? I mean, God is saying, you know what? Your descendants are going to be like the stars of the sky. But your descendants are going to be enslaved for 400 years. But they'll come back. But the reason why we need this time is because the Amorites, who are part of the Canaanite peoples there in the land, their iniquity is not yet complete. I mean, what does that have to do with anything? Well, God has a plan. In fact, later on, when they come into the promised land after 40 years of wandering with Moses, Joshua leads the people and they conquer the land. They conquer the inhabitants of the land. And the inhabitants of the land, they were evil people. You know, sometimes people say, well, why does God have to judge people? Because they're evil. It's not arbitrary. It's not random. I don't know. This sounds kind of strange. But yet, Abram believes in Yahweh. So when God tells him, I am Yahweh, who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess this, do you think God means that? So Abram asked God, oh Lord Yahweh, how may I know that I will possess it? So Abram asked the question, God, how do I know this is going to actually happen? You say I'm going to possess this land. How will I possess this land? And that's when God takes a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He tells Abram to get that, and then Abram splits the first 3 down the middle, lays them opposite of each other. He doesn't split the birds. And God appears in the form of a smoking oven and a flaming torch and passes between the pieces. It says, on that day, Yahweh cut a covenant with God. This is a pretty significant thing. God is saying, my promise is guaranteed. May I be cut in half if I don't keep my word. Abram didn't have to do anything. God is saying, it doesn't even matter, Abram. You don't need to do anything here. I'm going to fulfill my promise. So the next question I had was, I wonder how much Abram told Sarai about all this. What did she know? I mean, I would think that Abram would have shared with her. It doesn't say specifically. But what we do know, and we looked at this last week, that Abraham was recognized as a man of faith. He believed what God said. He exercised trust. God acknowledged it. So then why in Genesis 16 does Sarai seem to take things into her own hands, possibly with the full knowledge of the covenant promise of God that he had made with Abram, that a nation would come from his seed? But here's the obvious struggle. I mean, she's getting old. And so that's why when you read Genesis 16:2, Sarai says, Yahweh has shut my womb from bearing children. We could put it simply, she is not exercising faith. She doesn't trust the promise of God. But I think it's understandable. If you're someone who's past the time of having children, you just go, well, it's just the biology of it. I mean, it's not supposed to happen. But we could tell that, at least in understanding Sarai, you have to remember, she is bearing the greatest curse a woman could bear, in that she's barren. She's not able to have children. So she took things into her own hands. Now here's kind of like the sad testimony of Abram. He just does what Sarai tells him. Instead of trusting in the Lord himself, he trusted in Sarai's taking control of the situation. So in Genesis 16:4, it says, so he went into Hagar and she conceived. Then she saw that she had conceived, so her mistress became contemptible in her sight. I mean, this is just a bad story getting worse. So he does what Sarai says. She becomes pregnant, and when she becomes pregnant, it says that she saw Sarai as contemptible. She showed contempt toward Sarai. It was almost as if she's saying, look at me. I got a baby. How do you think Sarai took that? Not so well. And this is where, you just see the humanity of this all. In verse 5, Sarai said to Abram, may the violence done to me be upon you. I gave my servant woman into your embrace, but she saw that she conceived, so I became contemptible in her sight. May Yahweh judge between you and me. That must not have been a very pleasant conversation. She's upset with Abram. But Abram did what she asked. I mean, does this does it ring a bell with maybe any of the married folks? You're like, hey, just do what I say. Some husbands have heard that. So they're like, okay, I'll do it. And then you do it. Why did you do that? You told me to do that. I'm thinking, hey, this is what Abram's saying. But she invokes God. She goes, may God judge. And I'm thinking, okay, I don't know what to do. Abram doesn't know what to do. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant woman is in your hand. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarai afflicted her. What did she do? I don't know. But it wasn't nice. It was bad enough where Hagar fled from her presence. She was running away. Then she meets the angel of Yahweh and says, she hears, return to your mistress, humble yourself under her hands. But she receives a promise. I will greatly multiply your seed so that they will be too many to be counted. Now, this is not a good reflection on Abram. It's not a good reflection on Sarai. Hagar enters into the scene, and she is told that her seed will become too numerous to count. And if you follow the storyline, and I've mentioned this before, this is the beginning of the whole Middle Eastern conflict. The descendants of Ishmael are the descendants of the Arabs. Just wanted to throw in an application point here, especially for the married folks. You might have heard the phrase, happy wife, happy life. Not necessarily true. Why? I mean, husbands, if you think that the only thing that will make life peaceable is that you try to make your wife happy, well, what does it mean to be happy? To get what you want? But what if what you want is not what God wants? I mean, you just have to ask that. Even if it's a good thing that you might want. It's not a bad thing that Sarah wanted to have a child, but the way she went about it was not a good way. And husbands, if you trust God, are you able to, at that point, lovingly but firmly say, no, that's wrong? It's a good desire, but it's being pursued in the wrong way. I can't do that. Because we need to honor God first. I mean, guys, these days a lot of husbands are kind of weak sauce. Because you don't want to get your wife upset. So you'll do whatever she wants, even if it's not a God-honoring thing. Sarah thought that having a child through Hagar would make her happy. Not true. Abraham cooperated with the idea. He shouldn't have. Sarah isn't happy because as soon as Hagar gets pregnant, she shows contempt. So then she mistreats Hagar. Everything is going bad. So by the time Genesis 17 rolls around, things aren't good. Ishmael is born, still no biological baby for Abram and Sarai. Go to Genesis 17, verse 1. So we jump forward a little bit. Now it happened that when Abram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless so that I may confirm my covenant between me and you and that I may multiply you exceedingly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God spoke with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations, and no longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, and I've made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will go forth from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your seed after you. And I will give to you and to your seed after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. God said further to Abraham, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your seed after you throughout the generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep. Between me and you and your seed after you, every male among you shall be circumcised. And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations, one who is born in the house or one who is bought with money from any foreigner, who is not of your seed, a servant who is born in your house or who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. But an uncircumcised male who's not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Yeah. I don't know if you're doing your quiet times and reading that part in Genesis. I mean, all I could think of is, ooh, that's a weird covenant. I mean, this is an awkward thing to have to discuss, but it's there. God says this is the sign of the covenant. All the men need to be circumcised. And we find out later, Abraham obeys. Every male is circumcised. That had to be a painful week. But I'm thinking, Abraham is again walking by faith. He is doing something that just makes absolutely no sense, especially for older folks. Why would you do this? Because God says, this is the sign of my covenant that you physically bear. Woo! Now in verse 15, God says, Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name, which incidentally means princess. And I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her. So if you follow the narrative, God is reaffirming this covenant, but he's getting more specific as time goes on. And so God tells him very specifically, you will have a son. Sarah, she is now going to be called Sarah. She will bear a son. But look at Abram's response. Okay, now he's Abraham, verse 17. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart. Now again, if you read this, imagine this. You know, he fell on his face before in response to God, worship, and he's essentially doing the same thing, but he laughs. And he said in his heart, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a son? He's saying this in his heart. God says, no. Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son. You shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for seed after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will bless him, will make him fruitful too, will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes. I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. I mean, as the story unfolds, it's happening in ways that you just wouldn't maybe have anticipated. Even through the bad decisions, God is still accomplishing his plans. God is still in control. Whatever Abram and Sarah have done, it's not outside of his control. But he reiterates, and he gives even more detail. Sarah will bear a son. You shall call his name Isaac. He is the one through whom I will establish my covenant for an everlasting covenant. If you can understand, God is saying, when I make a promise, I will keep it. I will never break this covenant. I have made this covenant with you. Verse 21, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. So God tells Abram, next year this time, you're going to have a son. You will name him Isaac. Verse 22, so he finished talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael's son and his whole household, and they were circumcised. Now, again, when you look at all this, and we don't have a lot of detail, what we do see is that Abraham, we see the humanity of Abraham. He's wondering, how will a son be born to someone who is 100 years old? Sarah's 90 years old. God, I have Ishmael. God says, no, he's not the covenant seed, but I will still bless him. Now, I could imagine after God has this conversation with Abraham and he acts on it, so he is still living by faith. Now, Sarah is going to have to hear this. And how does she respond? Well, jump over to Genesis chapter 18, verse 9. So again, God comes, visits Abraham, and he says in verse 9, where's Sarah, your wife? And he said, there in the tent. Verse 10, and he said, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. Again, she is being acknowledged as someone who cannot have children. Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also? Now, Abraham laughed. Sarah laughs now. We're going to see later laughter comes back onto the scene. Yahweh says, Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Saying, shall I indeed bear a son when I'm so old? Verse 14, and this is a verse you should really keep in mind. Is anything too difficult for Yahweh? Is anything too difficult for Yahweh? Well, you see, I think how you answer that question all depends on how you view Yahweh. Is he capable of doing things that are beyond what you are able to do, even if it makes no sense to you? I mean, especially those of you who are very practical and pragmatic and very logical and rational. And you're like, no, this does not happen. You cannot have children at a certain point. God, you made it this way. God, no, it doesn't happen. Do you understand what it's like to talk to God that way? Or maybe you don't talk to God that way, but maybe you just sort of make decisions on your own. Saying, well, God, yeah, whatever. I just need to do the things I need to do. I need to do what makes sense to me. I need to make plans. I need to take care of business. I need to have a legacy. I need to have children. I'll do whatever it takes to have children. God had made a promise. God said, I will make a nation out of you, but they don't even have one. It is understandable from a human standpoint. But is anything too difficult for Yahweh? Now God hears Sarah laughing. So he says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too difficult? At the appointed time, I will return to you. At this time next year, Sarah will have a son. And then it says, Sarah denied it, however, saying, I did not laugh. She actually tells God. She hears this conversation. God says, Abraham, why did she laugh? Sarah jumps in and says, I didn't laugh. But it says she said that because she was afraid. Oh yeah, you should be afraid because God's calling you out. But she responds by saying, I didn't laugh. And he said, God says, no, but you did laugh. No, you laughed. I mean, why are you denying him? Sarah must not have thought that God could hear what she was saying to herself, because it says that she was saying this to herself. But to make it worse, she denied it when God asked why she laughed. But God doesn't let her slide. She said, I didn't laugh. No, you did laugh. And then it ends there. That's it. That's it. You don't get any more of the story. We don't have the liberty to put something in there that isn't there. But you have to just wonder, as the next year goes by, what is happening day after day after day? What's going on in Sarah's mind and heart? Now, in between that time, they go to Gerar and they meet Abimelech, and then Abraham asks Sarah to again lie on his behalf. what's really ironic about that whole situation is that at the end, and this is in Genesis 20, Abram has to pray for Abimelech and his wife and his people because all their wombs were shut because of the situation with Sarah. I mean, it just doesn't even make sense. Abraham's the one who lied. He took Sarah because he was like, well, she's fair game. You said I could marry her. But all the women, their wombs are shut because of what happened. I mean, why are they being punished for something that Abraham and Sarah did that was wrong? I mean, it's just such a strange story. But she was the one who was barren. You just wonder what Sarah was thinking. Because of what she and Abram had done, others were judged with the same judgment that she had. Jump over to Genesis 21, verse 1. Now Yahweh visited Sarah as he had said. Yahweh did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived, bore a son to Abram in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. Abram called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. I mean, follow the wording there. It's pretty specific because everything that God said has been carried out. At the appointed time, you will bear a son. Sarah will bear a son. She will conceive. Every particular point has come true. In verse 4, Abraham circumcised his son on the 8th day, as God had commanded. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. You know, when Angela and I were expecting Olivia, I was about to turn 40. And in our culture, in our time, that's considered a little bit older to have children. I mean, it's not that it's impossible. But I remember some people kind of like half jokingly said, hey, Abraham and Sarah, you're having a kid. No, we were not Abraham and Sarah. But you do get a little bit of an idea, like, well, yeah, the older you get, this expectation, you don't have it anymore. Because at a certain point, it just doesn't happen. But at 100 years old, Isaac was born to him. Now, here's what's really, I think, ironic. Okay, look at verse 6. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. She laughed in unbelief. And now she is laughing with joy in the fulfillment of God's promise. God has kept his word. I mean, who would have said that Sarah would nurse children? God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. It's interesting that laughter is a part of the story. There is a laughter of unbelief, but there's a laughter of celebration and joy. Now, you would think it would be nice if it just kind of ended there. But the next passage, this is the last thing we hear about Sarah before she dies. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, Ishmael, whom she had borne to Abraham. Notice, Ishmael is laughing in jest. He's joking around. How does Sarah respond to this? She is not happy. Therefore, she said to Abraham, drive out this maidservant and her son, the son of this maidservant shall not be an heir with my son, with Isaac. For the second time, she wants Hagar out. Why? Because Ishmael is laughing, maybe in a mocking way, making fun of, maybe joking, but she doesn't appreciate it at all. She says, Ishmael, will have nothing to do with my son. Now, this distressed Abraham greatly because this is his son. So God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and your maidservant. And this is really interesting. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her voice, for through Isaac your seed shall be named. And of the son of your maidservant, I will make a nation also, because he is your seed. So the next morning, Abraham rose up early, took bread and a skin of water, gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, gave her the child, and sent her away. I mean, this is like a Korean drama almost. It's just everything's weird and crazy. Why does Sarah do this? Well, we don't maybe understand why it turned out this way. But God is actually telling Abram, do what Sarah tells you. You shouldn't have done what she told you before, but in this case, do what she tells you. Why? Because actually through this whole sequence of events, Isaac will be established as the covenant child. Abram has to trust God, act by faith, that God will be true to his word regarding Isaac, but also regarding Ishmael. I don't know if you've really had a chance to just look at that story from Sarah's perspective, but then you go back to Hebrews 11, and it says of Sarah, by faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive even beyond the proper time of life, since she regarded him faithful who had promised. Now, we don't see an explicit declaration, but Sarah had to trust God through all of this too. She wasn't a perfect person, but she had to trust God with everything about this. Now, just in case you think, well, I don't know, it doesn't seem like Sarah is highly regarded. Actually, she is very highly regarded. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 3. That's the last thing we'll look at. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1. In the same way, you wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, as they observe your pure conduct with fear. Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on garments, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible quality of a lowly and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being subject to their own husbands. Verse 6. Just as everything that Peter's talking about in this passage, who is the example? Just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, you have become her children if you do good. And listen to this last phrase, not fearing any intimidation. Not fearing any intimidation. You could put it this way. Everything that's being talked about in this passage is a description of Sarah, because she's the example. She's a holy woman. She's one who hoped in God. She adorned herself by being obedient and submissive. Peter says, be subject to your own husbands, even when they are disobedient to the word. She was. Abraham was disobedient. Now, it doesn't mean Sarah did everything perfect, but she was submissive and obedient when Abraham told her, tell them you're my sister. At least twice. Now, I don't think this is advocating that wives are simply to just do something sinful on behalf of the husbands. But the posture of her life was one that was submissive. Sarah had the character of one who you could say had the hidden person of the heart, the incorruptible quality of a lowly and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. This was Sarah's trademark, her defining trait. For all her faults, she regarded God as faithful. She was ultimately submissive to God. I mean, if we want to find fault with Sarah, we better find much more fault with Abraham. Abraham failed again and again and again. Yet he is called someone who walked by faith. We don't have a lot of information about Sarah. But I think it's significant that she is mentioned, even if it's under the umbrella of Abraham. She, in her own right, is someone who should be recognized as one who lived by faith. So verse 12, this just sums it up. Therefore, they were born even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. God kept his promise. Abraham only saw Isaac and Ishmael. He didn't see as many that were like the stars in the sky. But he knew God was going to keep his word. He didn't get any physical inheritance in the land. He only owned a cave to bury Sarah in. But he knew that God would give it to his seed as a possession. Ultimately, God is the one who is faithful in the story. You see, when we live by faith, it's not because we do so perfectly. I mean, think about this. Who of us can claim we are so faithful that we don't fail? You look at all these folks. Some of them have much more negative shared about their lives in Scripture. I think that's actually encouraging, because that means people like us have hope. Why? Because God is faithful. God is the faithful one. He keeps his promises. He will carry us through, even in the midst of our failures. So will you walk by faith, like Abraham and Sarah, in the midst of impossible circumstances? Compared to them, I don't know if we could say our circumstances are so impossible, but we know that nothing is impossible with God. Nothing. As we prepare for communion,